Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about understanding what support at home is, how it has changed since we had the major legislation change of the 1st of November 2025, and we're also going to give a little bit of an update on residential aged care and how that has changed. Just before we begin our presentation today, I will say that the information that we're going to provide is of a general nature only. It obviously does not take into account your individual circumstances. So if you are a client of RFS and you would like individual advice, please by all means give us a call. We'd be happy to provide that. If you're not a client of RFS advice and need personal advice, that's okay too. You can give us a call as well. But this is obviously general and factual information only. So today's discussion is going to talk a little bit about what support at home is, how it all works, and also provide a little bit of an update on how residential aged care has transformed as well, and then a few things to think about as we begin the journey into the care environment. So why does this matter so much? Well, for a lot of us as we get older, the one thing that we don't want to do is go to a nursing home. And the good news is the government agrees with you. It actually costs them a lot of money to have somebody in a nursing home, so they would far prefer for you to stay as independent in your own home for as long as possible. And so what we see is that there is a lot of government assisted care available, but it is important how we access that and when we start the planning process, because sometimes it ends up being a case of we've left it too long and the care that we need is quite substantial, and the wait to actually access that care means that we're ending up in a nursing home prematurely. So it is important to understand what the landscape looks like, how we can access the services that we need, and potentially how those services can assist us to stay as independent as possible for as long as possible. So if we look at the care environment as a whole, you can see that there are several ways to access care. Fundamentally, if we're in our own home, whether that's a family home or whether it's in a retirement village or a land lease community, we can access care in one of two ways. There's either the private funded care, so in other words, you decide what care you want and you pay for it out of your own pocket, or there is the government subsidised in-home care. Now, in terms of the government subsidised care, there's several potential avenues that you can travel down to access care. The first of which, and the sort of the base level, is the Commonwealth Home Support Program. Then there is a higher level of care is available through the home care package. That's the previous name for it, or it's now called a support at home package. And then if we need substantial care that basically we're not safe to remain home by ourselves, then we're probably moving into residential aged care, where you're moving out of your home and into the nursing home, so to speak. All of that care, however, has a gateway, and that gateway is the My Aged Care system. So that's the umbrella, and you cannot pass go, you cannot collect $200 unless you get what is called an ACAT assessment. So ACAT stands for Aged Care Assessment Team. That's the old terminology for it. Most people still know it by that name though. But what it is a care assessment. So it's a needs assessment done by a trained aged care professional. Currently, that job or that function is tendered out to various private organisations. So it's no longer a government department, so to speak, that does those assessments. It's actually companies that have tendered for the right to provide the assessment. And they have a template that they work to. And so in theory, you should get the same outcome no matter which organisation does your assessment. So that assessment is a big long interview where they'll basically ask about all of the challenges and what the needs and priorities are, what the goals are, and what levels of support are currently available to you. So one of the big mistakes that I often see people make is that when the assessor says, so how are you coping? And the potential care recipient says, I'm fine. And they might ask, so how are you going with the cooking? Oh no, I'm managing. So how are you going with the cleaning? I'm managing. And so it sounds like actually you don't need any care. And so that's what they have to mark on their assessment. What we actually need to be doing when we approach that assessment is talking through the very real challenges. I'm not saying that you should fudge anything. I'm not saying that you should make yourself out to be worse than what you are. But I think what we need to realize is that it is important to talk about our worst day when all the wheels fell off. There was no family around to support, and therefore the fact that we do actually need some care, rather than what we hope our best day is going to look like. So in other words, don't sugarcoat what it is that you actually need. So in that, once that assessment is complete, there is then a process where that is the assessor goes back and inputs the data, and then you will receive a letter which gives the outcome of the interview, and it will say something like either we believe that you would benefit from the following services. So for example, gardening and cleaning and meal preparation, and it will give you a referral code for each of those. Now, if that's the case, then you're under what's called the Commonwealth Home Support Program. Now, that means that you're not actually getting funding allocated to you as an individual. You're merely got a set of magic numbers, which may not be quite so magic as what you think, in order to go and get some services. So you have to go and apply to the various agencies in your particular region or geographical region that might be offering those services. So there might be 3 or 4 different organisations that have funding for cleaning, but they might not have any spaces in their lineup. So in other words, they may be fully subscribed and they can't actually take on anybody new. In that case, you end up missing out. And that's a frustration that a lot of my clients experience, because although they have the magic number doesn't actually deliver a service for them, because there's just not either a provider that's offering that service in their area, or there isn't space in that provider's lineup. The next level of care up, though, is more hopeful, because that is called supported home, and in that case you're actually being allocated a set of funding that is for you personally. So it might be anywhere between a level 1 through to a level 8 home care package, and that home care package is basically for you to go and contract with a home care provider or manage it yourself, but you will then have the ability to say what kind of care you're needing, what services it is that's going to support you best at home, and they'll put together a care plan and let you know what the costings look like. So in that case, your funding is yours and you spend that budget on the services that you require. So obviously level 1 is a fairly low level of budget and level 8 is quite substantially high. By the time you get to a level 8 package, you're needing quite a bit of support at home, and the next step up from that is really a situation where you're not going to be able to stay at home and you might need to move into residential aged care. Residential aged care also requires that same ACAT assessment, and it has its own referral code. Whether it's permanent care or respite care, it's going to have a referral code attached to it. So that's how the My Aged Care umbrella basically provides the authority for you to go and receive services. If we have a look at that typical journey that people go on, they start with a fairly low level of support. There might be quite a bit of family support to start with, and then it might get to the point where really family can't fill all the gaps, and so we're accessing higher and higher levels of care. Once we've had that first ACAT assessment, there is usually a wait for that first one, and there's usually a queue for funding. But once we've got the funding and we've kind of in the system, so to speak, then reassessments tend to be a little bit easier. Accessing higher levels of care tends to be a little bit easier as well. Once we get to the point where it's not safe for us to remain at home and have just the supported home supports, then it's probably a situation where we're transitioning into residential aged care, where obviously there's 24/7 care available, it's more structured, and we've got a lot more support around us to be able to be safe. So what has happened on the 1st of November 2025? Well, the government introduced new legislation. It was actually supposed to come in on the 1st of July 2025, and they delayed it because it is a very significant change. They have reformed the whole way that the system works specifically for home care. It's now obviously supported home is the new name for it, but there's a very substantial change around the way that costs are working for that program. They might have touted it as being simpler, but really in reality, it is not simpler at all. There's a lot more confusion around what the costs are. There are some parallels between how the supported home package system is working and NDIS. Some of those parallels are not necessarily flattering or good. So we are seeing that providers in the space have had to rethink the way in which they do business. They are struggling to adapt to the way that the new billing system is working, and also how their own financial health is going to deal with the new way of charging. But before we get to all the fees and the ins and the outs, what is it that we can actually access via supported home? What are the things which are useful to us? And they range anything from grocery shopping through to wound care, through to getting dressed and having a shower, through to social outings. So there's a huge variety of potential services that we can access at home. There is some differences in terms of how much each of those services cost, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we go through it. But fundamentally, our access to the home support begins with that aged care assessment. It's a needs assessment, and once that has been done, a level of funding is allocated to us, and then from there we can start to contract with a provider who will formulate for us a care plan. That care plan will have 3 categories of services. There's clinical care, there's independent support, and there's everyday living services. There is a 4th set of funding, or 4th category, which is called home modifications and equipment. That really is not part of the same budget. So in other words, we access funding for equipment and aids separately. It used to be that you could purchase that equipment through your home care package. That's no longer the case. There's actually a separate funding mechanism for it now entirely. So the idea is that you will be able to tailor the care to suit your lifestyle, your needs, and your independence. So what do those levels of care actually look like? From a level 1 to 2 perspective, it's a low level of support. It might only be sort of once a week that you're getting somebody into your home to provide a service, and the budget sort of ranges between $10,000 to $16,000. If we're looking at moderate support levels, then it's levels 3 to 5, and that's a bit more regular in terms of how the service is provided. It's probably a couple of times a week. Our budget is somewhere between $21,000 and $39,000 a year. And if we've got the high levels of support, obviously much harder to get, and also a bit of a wait time, but that's a significant level of support. It's $48,000 to $78,000 worth of funding in a year, and that's pretty much either big blocks of care several times a week, or care, every single day coming into the home. So how do we get charged, and what do we pay? What does the government pay? Well, our costs are going to vary depending on our financial circumstances. It's based on our income and assets. It's based on our pensioner status with Centrelink. Now, some of us will be full-age pensioners, some of us will be part-age pensioners, some of us will have a Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, and some of us will be fully self-funded retirees. We're going to pay a means tested contribution for each of the services, barring one type, that is based on our pensioner status. So it's different for supported home than it is for residential aged care. Residential aged care also has means tested costs, and we'll talk a little bit about those later on. But fundamentally, our contributions are divided up via a matrix that you can see here on the screen. So first of all, they will ask, which category does our service that we want fall into? So is it clinical care, is it independent support, or is it everyday living? So if we're thinking about clinical care, that's going to be anything that requires a medical professional. So that might be physiotherapy, it might be wound care. That's going to be clinical care, and you can see that nobody has a contribution towards that. In other words, it's fully billed to the package. If we're looking at independent support, that's things like having a shower and dressing. So if we need help with that type of thing, or being able to go out or transport to medical appointments or things like that, then if we're a full pensioner, we're going to pay 5% of the cost. If we're a part pensioner, somewhere between 5 and 50%. And for a fully self-funded retiree, we're paying half the cost of that service. Everyday living things are generally the types of services that people first want to access. And they are things like cleaning, meal preparation, gardening. Those are traditionally the first types of services that people want to access when they first get their low-level supported home package. And you can see that the contribution towards those services is actually highest. So for a fully self-funded retiree, they're paying 80% of the cost of that service. So when you stop to think about it, that's going to likely mean that it's not necessarily wise to be putting cleaning, if you're a fully self-funded retiree, inside of your home care package. You might just pay for it privately outside, and you might actually get a better deal. And there are reasons for that. So what does it look like in terms of the numbers? If we had a $100 service, so let's say it's a $100 service of physiotherapy. If we are a full pensioner or a part pensioner or even a self-funded retiree, we don't pay any contribution at all. So in other words, a $100 charge comes off the package budget as $100, and we don't get a bill for that at all. If we want to have a shower and somebody to help us get dressed, and that charge is $100, again, we reduce the budget by $100, but then we get a bill at the end of the month, and what bill we get is dependent again on what our pensioner status is. So a full age pensioner is going to pay $5 towards that. A self-funded retiree is going to pay $50 towards that. And then if we're looking at, say, $100 worth of cleaning, then we're going to see again, we reduce the package budget by $100, and we will get a bill at the end of the month if we're a full pensioner for $17.50, but if we're a fully self-funded retiree, it's going to be an $80 bill. So if we're looking to optimize the package and how we're spending it, if we're a self-funded retiree, those everyday services don't really make sense. So what we have moved from was a situation where we had potentially an income tested fee that we just paid in per day to our home care package, and that was prior to 1 November 2025. Post 1 November 2025, we are paying per service. So that means that what type of service we're accessing and our pensioner status is going to determine what we pay. There is a no worse off principle. So in other words, if you were already receiving a home care package, and particularly if you were approved or receiving that package prior to 12 September 2024, that was the grandparented date, then there is that no worse off principle, which means that there are accommodations in terms of what you contribute towards each service. You're supposed to end up no worse off. Going forwards, if you are only joining the program now, you're fully under the new system and you will pay all those new rates. The other change that we need to talk about is that there's no rolling of budgets. So previously people hoarded their home care package budget. They built up the money inside of that package, and then they would be able to buy some big piece of equipment, or they might just hoard it because they didn't actually need the services or didn't want the services. But that budget was then stuck as allocated to those people and not being able to circulate around to people who did need it. And so effectively we were sitting with a lot of allocated money that wasn't being spent within that home care package system. Under the new system, you're only going to be allowed to roll a very small amount from one quarter to the next. In other words, it's a use it or lose it situation. There is, for that reason, because it is a use it or lose it situation, there is separate funding for equipment. So there is no need to hoard your budget up and try and purchase your large piece of equipment, whether that's a wheelchair or whatever it might be, because effectively there is a separate set of funding for that. There is also a limit on what providers can now charge for administration. Previously, we would see up to 25 or 30% of the budget disappear on administration and care management. They're now limited to 10%. And that has meant that they have had to rethink the way that they charge, because they've only got 10% for administration. That means that their per hour charge has all of a sudden jumped right up. So instead of being what might have previously been $55 to $60 an hour for a carer, we're now seeing charges of $100, $110 plus per hour. So what are we doing to support clients? Well, we've done a fair bit of research around what home care providers are out there. We've actually interviewed a fair few in our office here and had a good long chat about what their philosophy is, how they support their clients, what their process looks like, how their fees look, etc. So if you are needing support in accessing the home care provision, we're able to have a sit-down chat with you, obviously provide further information, but also potentially point you in the direction of providers that we know to be trustworthy and good. There are different providers specializing in different things as well, so it does help to know what different providers are providing what services and how those can support you. So when we have a look at residential aged care and how that has actually changed, we have some interesting situations with the old rules and the new rules and the no worse off principle. It's going to create some headaches for us pretty much a couple of decades into the future, because there are three potential outcomes for you. If you entered care prior to 1 November 2025, then you actually remain under the old rules. That's fine, quite nice and simple and straightforward. You are what we call grandparented. If you are a person who is entering care after 1 November 2025 and you had an approved home care package already in place, or you were waiting for the funding but you'd had approval for your home care package prior to 12 September 2024, then you will have a combination of old rules and new rules. You will have the new accommodation rules, but you will have the old means testing rules. So there will be some things that you do pay and some things that you don't pay, which are different than people entering completely fresh under the new rules. So if you're entering care post 1 November 2025 and you didn't have a home care package in place at 12 September 2024, then you are fully under the new system and you pay all of the new fees and charges as they apply to you under the means testing regime that's current. So of course that's not complicated at all. It just throws a curveball at everybody because it's not clear immediately just by looking at the surface which regime one might fit under. But there are still 4 potential categories of fees in residential aged care. That much hasn't changed. We've still got an accommodation cost, so that's the advertised price for the room. That's sometimes referred to as a RAD, refundable accommodation deposit. And you might hear RADs quoted of anything between $500,000 up to $3 million, just depending on where your room is situated geographically and what the nursing home that you're targeting is likely to charge. So the accommodation payment for RAD payers is a bit different under the new system. Any lump sum that you lodge is now not 100% refundable, whereas previously it was 100% refundable. Now the nursing home is required to retain a 2% portion each year for a maximum of 5 years. So for example, if you lodged a lump sum of $500,000, whether that's the full room cost or not, they are required to retain 2% per year. So that 2% adds up over the course of 5 years to approximately $50,000. So that accommodation scenario is not quite as beneficial as what it previously was. Previously, as we said, you got 100% refunded back to you. There is still some government assistance available for people who have a low asset position. So there are still some thresholds whereby if you fall beneath that threshold, you're in a situation where the government will assist with the accommodation cost. But what we're finding, unfortunately, is that the requirement for nursing homes to actually keep a certain portion of their beds available for people of low means has fallen away. And so when we look at how they are operating their balance sheet, for a lot of those providers, it makes far more sense to just say that they're only accepting RAD payers or people who are able to pay the advertised price for the room rather than low means residents. So that's creating a squeeze in that low means space, and at some point we may see a crisis develop in that regard. So that is a significant concern for many of us in the industry. The second layer or level of fees that will be charged in residential aged care is what we call the essential living expenses. So for everybody in care, there will be a basic daily fee that is linked to the single rate of age pension. It's 85% of the full single pension. And so at the moment, that equates to around $66.80 per day. That covers food, water, electricity, laundry, etc. And most people understand that you would pay for those things at home anyway, so that's not a contentious fee. There is, however, on top of that, potentially a means-tested hotelling contribution. So this is an extra fee which up until the 1st of November 2025, the government actually kicked this in for every single resident in residential aged care. At the moment, the maximum that of this contribution is $22.15 per day. Now, for people who had the Magic Home Care package already approved prior to 12 September 2024, they won't be asked to pay this hotelling contribution because they fall under the old means testing regime. But for people who did not have that grandparented status, you may be asked to contribute towards the hotelling contribution. The third layer of fees that we look at is the means tested care fee. Well, that was what it was previously called. The new name for that care contribution is now called the non-clinical care contribution. So under the previous system, the maximum means tested fee in this third layer of fees was actually over $400 a day. Under the new system, we've got that non-clinical care contribution. The maximum that can be is actually $107 a day, so substantially less. But having said that, there is a lower level of assets where this kicks in. So means testing has changed. Now again, if you had a home care package in place prior to 12 September 2024, you would still be under that old means tested care fee situation. The lifetime cap on that means tested care fee situation is actually only approximately $86,000. That is indexed, so it is a moving goalpost, but that's a lot lower than the maximum for the non-clinical care contribution, which is $137,000 plus. Again, indexed fairly often. So the old means testing rules do tend to produce a slightly more beneficial outcome, but you are only able to access those if you had that home care package in place prior to 12 September 2024. The new non-clinical care contribution also has one other feature which I think is really good, and that is that it is only payable for a maximum 4 years. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you might move into care and your assets are structured in such a way that you don't have one of those non-clinical care contributions to start off with, but then once you've sold your house and moved your assets around, you end up with a non-clinical care contribution. From the time that you start paying that until 4 years down the line, that's the maximum amount of time that you can be asked to actually pay that non-clinical care contribution. So regardless of whether you reach the lifetime cap in terms of money, after a 4-year period, you will stop paying that non-clinical care contribution. So that's a positive thing for that particular layer of fees. And the fourth layer of fees, which I think is by far the most positive move the government has made in this overhaul entirely, is that you are no longer locked into paying a higher everyday living fee, or it used to be called additional services or extra services fees. Under the previous system, there were a lot of providers who used to basically back you into a corner and say, well, if you want to take this room, then you have to agree to this additional fee. And that additional fee could be anywhere between $25 a day up to $100 a day. And you didn't really get a choice as to whether or not you signed up for that. If you took the room, you had to have that additional fee. That was their way of actually staying in the black. Under the new rules, there is no opportunity for a provider to force you into taking their higher everyday living fee or their luxury package, so to speak. They have to sell it to you based on merit. You have the chance to opt out at any point that you want, and they cannot offer you that package until after you've already signed your residential care contract. In other words, you've already got the room. So it can't be a condition of you getting a room. So that, I think, is extremely useful and important, because it means that people who are not able to enjoy those extra services don't have to pay for them. Now, the offset for that is obviously the fact that there is a RAD retention amount going forwards. So that means that 2% that the nursing home gets to keep of the lump sums that are lodged is actually offsetting what they previously would have derived from their luxury package. So it should be a system where you are actually getting services that you want and need under that higher everyday living fee, rather than just a token list on a piece of paper that you might never have accessed but had to pay for previously. So to some degree, there are some positive things to come out of the changes in the residential aged care space, but it is somewhat complicated by that old new crossover transition or hybrid situation that a lot of people would experience. So with that accommodation payment that we have, we've got a choice of how we pay for the room. The advertised price of the room for a fully funded person, so in other words, they're paying all of the accommodation costs themselves, is referred to as the RAD. But you don't actually have to lodge a RAD necessarily. You've got a choice of lodging the RAD or having what's called a daily accommodation payment, or any combination of the two. Now, that sort of is analogous to a RAD being buying the room, a DAP being renting the room, and then the combination is basically anywhere in between those two extremes. So for a RAD, or a refundable accommodation deposit, the room price is quoted as that, so maybe $650,000. That would probably be considered a reasonably priced room. And you can lodge the full lump sum of $650,000, in which case all of your accommodation payment disappears from the bill each month. There is a RAD retention amount of 2% of that lump sum. So every year they would be keeping 2% for a maximum of 5 years. So a maximum of $65,000 that you will lose if you leave the room or pass away. The alternative to that is the rental style payment, known as the daily accommodation payment. And in this one, we're not lodging a lump sum at all. It's a case of paying rent, and the rent is worked out based on an interest rate that's set by the government. So at the moment, that interest rate is approximately 7.96%. Call it 8% if you like. And so if we think about $650,000 multiplied by 8% per year, we've got over $50,000 worth of rent or daily accommodation payment per year that we're kissing goodbye. So that's dead money. Our combination is anywhere in between the two. So for example, if the room was $650,000, we could lodge a $350,000 lump sum, and we could pay the other $300,000 as a daily accommodation payment. And we can even have that daily accommodation payment deducted from the lump sum that we've lodged. But obviously if we do that, we're eating away at the lump sum, and therefore we're creating a larger and larger daily accommodation payment as we go. So that's how accommodation can be structured. It's very flexible, but for the most part, it is something that people will seek some advice on to work out where the optimal sweet spot sits. And that sweet spot needs to take into account age pension outcomes, cash flow outcomes, sustainability. So it's all very well and fine to say, let's lodge the full lump sum, but you won't have access to that lump sum for any other purpose other than potentially having DAP deducted from it. So therefore, have you got enough money set aside in your bank account to be able to fund all of your personal costs, things like pharmacy bills, some clothing, medical bills, etc. So those are the things which we need to take into account before you decide which way you're going to pay for your accommodation. One of the most common questions we get asked around aged care means testing is how the home is actually treated. It is different in terms of aged care means testing than it is for age pension. So they're not treated exactly the same way for those two assessments. If we have a supported home package, and we're obviously remaining in our home to be able to receive that supported home package, the house is not an assessable asset at all. So that's quite simple and straightforward. But if we're moving into residential aged care, then we do have to ask the question, what's happening with the home? Because what's happening with the home will have a significant impact on our aged care fees. If we've got a scenario where we've got one member of a couple moving into residential aged care and one member of a couple remaining in the home, then the home is again exempt. It's not considered an asset at all. But if we've got nobody remaining in the home that's protected, then we are going to have our home assessed at a capped value of approximately $214,000 for aged care fees purposes. Now, the $214,000 is an interesting number. I don't know where they've plucked that from. If you could find me a house for $214,000, I'd be very happy. But fundamentally, the capped value of the home can actually be used to your advantage in some circumstances. So if you have a very expensive home, let's say you live in a home of $4 million, it's an interesting thing that the aged care means tested fee doesn't actually see $4 million at all. It only sees $214,000. If, however, we rent the house out, then our rental income that we receive from the house is going to be assessable income. That is going to be part of our income and assets assessment for aged care fees. And so that will impact what we pay as a daily means tested fee or non-clinical care contribution. If we sell the home, then we have effectively taken the whole of the sale proceeds and those become an assessable asset. So even if we pay a RAD, the RAD is still assessable for aged care fees purposes. So if we paid a RAD of $750,000, that $750,000 is an assessable asset when we're looking at the means tested care fee or the non-clinical care contribution. So there is an interesting debate then about whether it's actually useful to sell the home and move into care, or whether you should rent out your home, or whether potentially it's just going to be lived in by a family member to make sure that it's not empty. So those are all things which can form part of a strategy for how we actually sustainably and affordably move into residential aged care. And it's also something which we need to consider when we're trying to optimize preserving our wealth. So that's why people come to see aged care specialists like myself to try and work out what we should be doing with the family home to get the best result in terms of age pension, in terms of aged care fees, and in terms of wealth preservation. So when should we start planning for aged care? At what point is it actually useful for us to start the process of registering with My Aged Care, asking for an ACAT assessment, and getting into the system, so to speak? Well, there's no point in go and register with My Aged Care if you're not actually needing services, because at some point they'll say, well, you don't need to be registered, and so we'll just deregister you. There is no point to go and get an assessment if you know that you don't actually need the care. That's just going to be time consuming and a waste of everybody's efforts. But if we're starting to get to the point where certain tasks are quite challenging, or you look forward to the children coming over to be able to help you with those tasks, or you put off certain tasks until the children are there to help you with those, or you are diagnosed with a condition that you know is going to be degenerative, or mobility is starting to decline for whatever reason, then that's probably a trigger point at which we do start the process of registering with My Aged Care. And we probably do it slightly earlier than what we think we actually need the care, but we can still say that we are heading towards needing the care, because there is usually a wait for the ACAT assessment to actually take place, and then there is a wait to actually receive the funding that we might be eligible for. So there isn't a specific set in stone age or time frame, but we do just need to bear in mind that if we put off getting care in the earlier stages, if we wait until it's urgent and challenging and we actually need it so badly that we can't remain at home without having the care, then we've probably left it too late. Because one of the things that we do realize is that quite often there is that wait for a high level package. So if you've left it to the point where there's a high need and a high priority, and the wait time is sort of 12 to 18 months to access a high level package, then there's a strong possibility that you're actually going to end up in residential aged care prematurely, because you can't afford to actually wait the time period to be able to get the care that you need. So entering at the lower levels of care and then progressively moving up the higher levels of care package that are available is a better strategy and provides a better long-term outcome and a greater chance of staying at home for as long as possible, as independent as possible, than if one buries the head in the sand, does the ostrich, and then unfortunately realizes that there isn't actually the ability to wait for the care that we need. And so we end up in residential care. So that's a little bit of information from our side. And practical steps that families can take. Obviously, you've begun today. You've understood your care options, and there's more information available out there about what those options look like and entail. But certainly beginning the education process of what, where, how, and when is important. And then, of course, we need to review our financial position, and part of that discussion is how we're going to pay for our contribution towards the care. So discussing that with family and helping everybody to be on the same page to understand what wishes are and how you wish to have your care journey proceed is a really important thing. It can stop a lot of fights between siblings, children who are well-intentioned and well-meaning but don't necessarily understand what it is that you want out of the process. And at the end of the day, it's your money, it's your journey, and you should be able to have the journey in the way that you wish for it to happen. So before you make any snap decisions, obviously we do recommend that you get some advice and that you understand the financial implications of the potential outcomes that you're pursuing. So our key takeaways for today are, of course, that the supported home process program may have been designed to be simpler and more flexible and better, but there are some challenges. It is not simple or straightforward. There are a couple of little hurdles in there which can make things a little challenging. Certainly the industry is finding it challenging to adapt, and that does mean that for a lot of people the cost is higher. Most of us can achieve a really good outcome if we lean on the support that is available to us. And although there is a contribution on our part, that can mean that we have a greater and richer life experience in our last chapters, where we do need that support if we just lean on it and accept it, rather than allowing ourselves to be put into a position where there's no support, and so therefore there's only one outcome, and that's the hospital sends us off to residential care. We do see that a lot of people are concerned about the contributions that they may need to make towards care, and that's fair enough. But we do need to also bear in mind that the government does fund over 70% of aged care costs. So if we look at the whole situation from the Commonwealth Home Support Program all the way through to residential aged care, and we combine what the government provides for each of those types of care versus what is privately funded, the government is still funding over 70% of that total cost. So it is a significant contribution that they make, and if we plan early, we can afford to sort out our contribution towards that care. So making provision in our retirement planning to be able to afford that care in the future is important, and it is something that, even if you're not a client of RFS Advice, it is something that is important for you to chat to your financial planner about.